G'day viewers, I hope I'm finding you well. So today I wanted to share with you my methodology for being a detective or sleuth. And I suppose you could say that if you were going to cast me as a detective in a story, I would probably be something like the Vicar of Dibley. I don't know, one of those detective characters that is basically a vicar, a minister, a priest, and they kind of dabble in detective work or solving crimes. That's probably the closest analogy, I think, to my style or method of detective work. So how do you set about solving the unsolvable mystery, the unsolvable crime? I've actually written a screenplay based on my theory of a very famous series of murders that happened over 100 years ago in Whitechapel in London. And I've come up with a startling conclusion, and something that nobody else has ever come up with before. So people would say it's completely left field, and how could you possibly come up with that? You know, is it with superior intellect, superior methodology? Is it fantastic teamwork? Is it just due diligence or tenacity? Is it guts? You know, to be able to overcome your fear? Because let's face it, if you're trying to find out who a serial killer is, it's like chasing the devil. And that takes a lot of courage, a lot of guts to do it. It's not for the faint-hearted if you're going to go there. But ultimately, what is the key to cracking it? Because it would be ultimately hubris to say that it was just me and my capabilities. Far from the truth. The truth is, the only way to do it is in communicatione cum Deo. I'll say it again. In communicatione cum Deo. And my Latin may not be very good, but for those of you in the audience that can't understand Latin, I'll translate it. It is basically, what I'm saying is in communication with God. You probably guessed that. In communication with God. That's how you do it. So through prayer, obviously. So you're making a prayer request. You're asking God to reveal to you a hidden truth, which is beyond your ability to work out, to grasp, to understand. And then waiting for the answer. And from my experience, after having prayed those prayers, the answers have come to me almost as a matter of intuition. So I've prayed about, a crime that I've been interested in, and asked God to reveal to me who the person responsible is, person or persons. And then the answer has come just as a matter of intuition. Okay, that person. Or it's been, like heading me down a path of the kind of person you're looking for. So you're looking for a person who's medically qualified. In the case of the Jack the Ripper murders, all the evidence points to a person who's medically qualified, has surgical skills. So a medical doctor with surgical skills. My take on the evidence is that the profiling during that particular period that was used by Scotland Yard and may to some extent prevail or continue to be, a way of going about profiling today is that it involves a certain amount of bias, unfortunately. Bias. So if you know anything about the cases of the Whitechapel Jack the Ripper murders, you'll be aware of the fact that they were operating very much under a lot of presumptions. One of them was the presumption that medical professionals were beyond reproach. You know, they were not people that you would suspect of committing murder. False. That's a wrong presumption. Another one is that all murders of women are committed by men. False. Wrong presumption. So you've got two big stereotypes there blocking any progress, or blocked a lot of progress in this case. So my suspect, who was both a medical practitioner and a woman, in 1888 was basically invisible to the police. She was invisible, had a cloak of invisibility. And in a lot of ways it would have been horrible to be like that. To be, a professional person and, in a gender-biased society like it was back then, and to be just not noticed, like you didn't exist, sort of thing. That would have been, in a lot of ways, a horrible feeling, and possibly a part of the motivation, reason why these things happened. But ultimately, as I said, the inspiration for my insight has come directly from God. And I've just then followed the breadcrumbs, so to speak, put the pieces together in a puzzle, formulated a theory or theories, and then gathered the evidence and let the evidence ultimately tell the story. So I've written a screenplay upon one particular murder case that I investigated, and my screenplay is called The Ripper's Mistress. The first installment of it is called Part 1. I've got a second installment which I haven't finished writing. The working title of that one is going to be Mayhem, Part 2 Mayhem, because in the series of events of this tragic story, it will go from telling the life story and backstory of the main character. It will then go into the events that took place, theoretically, revolving around the Whitechapel murders, how they were involved in that crime, why they were involved in it, and what actually took place. But to start off with, there was I think the first screenplay only ends with maybe one or two murders having taken place by the end of it, because a large part of it is, as I say, historical background. Whereas the second installment, the pace is going to be more hectic. There's going to be a lot more murders happening. It's like a form of terrorism, domestic terrorism, basically, to scare the wits out of one individual, to bring about reform in a society which had reached a point of moral decadence, repugnant sort of moral decadence. So it's kind of a vigilante story, I suppose you could say, to some extent. The main central character in the story really is, I've portrayed them through their humanity. In no way have I attempted to portray them as a monster. I don't believe in that in terms of understanding a criminally minded person or somebody that's capable of committing criminal acts. I don't believe in reducing them to, the state of an animal, or thinking of them in terms of being an animal or a monster. I don't think of criminal people or people capable of committing crimes as being monsters per se or animals. I think that detracts from your ability to understand them. And if you want to solve crimes, I think you have to understand people and what motivates people, and steer clear of trying to cast them as monsters or animals. I don't think that's helpful in eventually catching them. Understand their humanity, and you will catch them much faster. That, I believe, is a part of the methodology that I would employ. So my screenplay hasn't tried to cast my suspect as a monster. I certainly wouldn't do that. I've seen their humanity in the events that occurred, and tried to show that above everything else. So I hope I did that successfully. Yes. So the other point that I really wanted to make here was let me think for a minute. It's sometimes it's difficult to keep your train of thought. Maybe I'll pause for a second and then come back to it. Okay, back again. So the other aspect of this that I wanted to run over with you briefly is the idea that not all crimes or mysteries are actually kind of something that you just kind of blurt out. That's probably the easy way of saying it. You don't want to be just blurting out truth in public, I find. Because even though you can work out who the person is that's responsible for a crime, it's not always wise to just blurt it out in public, because let's face it, a lot of people don't always want to hear the truth. I don't want to hear that. I don't want to hear that. It's the truth, but a lot of people just don't want to hear it. It's too hard for them to hear it. It's too hard for them to accept it. So not all truth is for public consumption. So in a way, although all these truths can be revealed in communicatione cum Deo, it's not always wise to then go public with a truth or truths. Yeah, so that's the other aspect of it. And there's many cases of that. I mean, God's justice ultimately in the end is going to be perfect justice. So this world is not about perfect justice, not at all. People do get away with murder. They get away with a lot of crimes for which they go unpunished during their own lifetime. But if you think in terms of God's justice, His final judgment, if you have the faith to believe that, then you will realise that nobody gets away with any crime in this lifetime. Everybody's ultimately brought to justice, and it's God's perfect justice. Yeah, so that is an important thing to keep in mind. Even if you can discover the truth or learn the truth, it's not always useful, helpful, practical that it becomes public knowledge. There you go. It's a strange world we live in. So God bless. Happy sleuthing.